So, Donald Trump yesterday signed a very important executive order, one whose intention is to rein in unelected bureaucrats and their never-ending thirst for power. This is an article from The Hill discussing this. They write, Trump signs order to expand White House control of independent agencies. This is by Brett Samuels. He writes, President Trump signed an executive order Tuesday aiming to expand the White House's authority over various independent regulatory agencies, a move likely to prompt legal challenges. Trump issued an order titled Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies that would require independent agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, to submit proposed regulations to the White House for review. The order also calls for the head of the Office of Management and Budget, currently Russell Vought, to review the agency's spending to ensure it aligns with the president's priorities. These regulatory agencies currently exercise substantial executive authority without sufficient accountability to the president and through him to the American people, the order states. Moreover, these regulatory agencies have been permitted to promulgate significant regulations without review by the president, or Congress, for that matter. Now, the executive action is expected to trigger a legal battle, The Hill writes, as Congress established that the agencies affected by the order would operate with some independence from the White House. As if we needed federal agencies to have independence. Please. Now, the order is the latest in a series of controversial moves by Donald Trump to try to consolidate power within the executive branch and root out what his advisors see as an unelected bureaucrats who could hinder his agency. Why would he not want to consolidate power within his own branch of government? And the heart of the executive order by Trump here was that all federal agencies must submit draft regulations for White House review before they can be finalized. This will include agencies traditionally considered independent, such as the FTC, the FCC, and the SEC, with the exception of monetary policy functions of the Federal Reserve. Now, this will have a major impact on how these agencies are run. It will ensure that all new regulations will align with the administration's policy goals, potentially reducing the autonomy of these agencies in setting the regulatory agenda. And let me be frank here. There should never have been so-called independent agencies making regulations in the United States. Laws should always have a direct tie-in to the voting American population. It is outrageous that we have allowed these nameless, faceless organizations to control our lives, American citizens' lives, and yet all my life, we have tolerated this nonsense and their growing power and control. Now, agencies will be required to consult with the White House regarding their priorities, their strategic plans, and performance standards. The White House will set these standards, which could align more agencies more closely with the executive branch. And as The Hill pointed out, the budget will be overseen by the Office of Management and Budget, ensuring that taxpayer dollars is used in a way that aligns with the administration's fiscal policy, meaning what the American people want, because the administration will be the ones that the American people have voted into office. Now, an area where people are angry about, specifically on the left, is the centralized interpretation part of this executive order. Essentially, the president and the attorney general, under presidential supervision, would interpret the laws for the executive branch, aiming to unify the legal interpretations across agencies, which is crucial because you have agencies like the EPA just willy-nilly deciding how laws should be interpreted and inflicting harm upon the American citizens in every state. So this executive order will essentially mean that conflicting or agency-specific interpretations of statutes will either be minimized or outright eliminated. And again, I got to ask, why did we ever tolerate these sniveling little agencies to have the power to interpret the statutes in the way that they see fit? There's no accountability for the American people. I mean, who are these little nobodies that get to decide how we must live our lives? We, the American people, we didn't vote for these a-holes in these bureaucratic agencies. This reining in of these three-letter agencies is long overdue. Frankly, I would love to have seen most of them disbanded and done away with, but in lieu of that, this is the next best thing. America didn't start a revolution over taxation without representation just to find ourselves under the thumb of some stupid three-letter agency and the bureaucrats that inhabit them. And the Trump executive order, in essence here, is arguing that these faceless, independent agencies have wielded too massive of power without sufficient presidential oversight, which means oversight of the people. And he is trying to rectify this. Now, as you can imagine, there will be legal challenges to this. You better rest assured there will be. The left will almost certainly lose their damn minds over this consolidation of power within the executive branch. They will cry and moan that Donald Trump's actions here will undermine the independence of agencies meant to operate with some autonomy to avoid political pressures. Political pressures are precisely what should be required for these kinds of agencies. We do not want a king in this country. We do not want faceless, nameless, fat little bureaucrats telling us how to live our lives. These weird, strange people in these bureaucracies are removed from the American people and our ability to kick them the hell out if they do things we do not like. This does not belong in America. We do not consent to being governed by a group of people who have no accountability to us. And yet, these agencies have been allowed to do just that for decades now. If Donald Trump's executive order stands, we can expect to see a seismic shift in how the regulatory agencies control the American people. Under a Donald Trump regime, we could expect to see a huge reduction in onerous regulations created by these agencies. Let's look at one agency in particular, one that I happen to personally despise the most. And that agency is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Since its creation back in 1970, the EPA, just by itself, mind you, has issued thousands of regulations, including both major rules like those on air and water quality and minor ones, specific standards for pollutants. By 2023, the EPA had published over 24,000 regulations in the Federal Register. They just do what they want, and we all take it in the shorts. Now, I'm going to give you an example of just one thing that they've done here. Let's talk about the Good Neighbor Rule. The law was originally designed to address interstate air pollution under the Clean Air Act of 1963. This rule required states to prohibit emissions that significantly or massively contributed to non-attainment or interfere with maintenance of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NOx, I guess, if you'd like. Now, the purpose of this, the primary goal of this, was to address and mitigate the effects of air pollution that traveled across state lines, impacting the air quality in neighboring or even distant states. This was crucial back then because of the amount of sulfur and dioxide, which was contributing to smog. See, back then, there were massive coal plants that were pumping out billowing clouds of smog into the air. These emissions had a massive contribution to regional air quality problems, including smog in urban areas far from the plant itself. And this was long before the climate activists got their claws into society, mind you. But naturally, time moved on, and eventually the climate weirdos got their claws into the EPA. And they began using this Good Neighbor Rule as a way to not just reduce smog, but to save the world. This would lead to a battle with the state of Massachusetts versus the EPA back in 2007. And the Supreme Court back then made the decision that ruled that greenhouse gases could be regulated under the Clean Air Act if they were deemed to endanger public health or welfare, which was a stupid decision by the Supreme Court because guess what the EPA did? Less than 2 years later, they issued their endangerment finding. And this finding officially recognized that greenhouse gases from human activities endangered public health and welfare, thus providing the legal basis that the EPA wanted for regulating these pollutants. And let's be honest with ourselves. These environmentalist wackos within the EPA were always going to claim that greenhouse gases were dangerous because that was part of their agenda. And so, the Clean Power Plan, or the CPP, began in earnest, and it moved full steam ahead. Their objective was aimed at reducing carbon dioxide, or CO2 emissions, from existing power plants, which are significant contributors to greenhouse gases. And of course, greenhouse gases are associated with global warming, global cooling, and what we now call climate change. So the EPA's plan that they proposed state-specific goals for CO2 emissions reductions, because of course they did, and they, and I'll put this nicely, encouraged or mandated a shift towards cleaner energy sources like natural gas, renewable energy, and increased energy efficiency. This also allowed the EPA to meddle in the affairs of everyday Americans by creating the vehicle emission standards as well. The EPA, not satisfied with just cleaning the air out of the power companies, decided that they needed increasingly stringent standards for greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, aiming to reduce transportation-related CO2 emissions. And so they began regulating the corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE, standards, and greenhouse gas emission standards for light-duty vehicles. The EPA sought to drive the automobile industry towards higher fuel efficiency and lower emissions, forcing automotive companies to move away from cars that their customers actually liked and force them to create ever more green car solutions. Now, this was all clearly not what the original intent was when the Clean Air Act was created. But naturally, the EPA just didn't care. They were their own bureaucracy. They had their own fiefdom. And they would do whatever they wanted to create a world full of nannies that would take charge of these stupid Americans and make them save the world. And so the Good Neighbor rule faced many legal challenges. There were states, there were industries, and environmentalist groups at times arguing over its scope, their stringency, and implementation. And finally, it all came to a head where the Supreme Court decided to block, in 2024, the rule temporarily, reflecting ongoing legal tensions over the EPA's regulatory authority. But my friends, it is only a matter of time before these weirdos once again try to continue their march to forced climate religion on the rest of us. In the meantime, Trump's executive order here will lead to lawsuits, and I just don't see how it won't, as they try to stop this in the near future. But for now, Trump's agenda continues on unabated.